same question you told me to ask, so because I didn't want to deviate. And then the crazy.
It's a wonderful
What a story, huh?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I've
What
heard
a
bits
story.
and pieces, detailed and
Then you sort of, you can understand how he can be a little more zealous in his arguments about stuff because he's been through the ringer.
I think I'll just go this way on down.
You know, we Democrats have been talking about policy and wrong about politics for a long time.
Good for him. I love that.
Talks about an economy, the new governor, 2 days after. Scott, I think
Yep. Right.
Understand.
You're gonna go over there?
Yeah.
You stand here.
Apparently, it got people's attention.
All right, that's great. Yeah, great idea.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for anyone tuning in now or in the future with our live stream. Just want to let you know that this is being streamed through YouTube. So by being here, you consent to that. You in the audience are not on video at all, but you will be heard during the Q&A through your voice. So if you would like to remain anonymous, just don't identify yourself by name. No one will know it's you. And my name is Abby. I work here at the library, so if you need anything, I'll be sitting over there. Just wave me down. But restrooms are right here, and that is pretty much it. Without further ado, we'll just get started. Thank you so much to our lovely panel here for being here. So thank you, and thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.
That is Abby Davis. She's the one for the Jefferson Madison Regional Library who arranged this, arranged for the live streaming and everything else. I'm Sarah McConnell. I'm the host of a public radio show called With Good Reason. It's produced above the dairy market at Virginia Humanities. So if you ever want to hang out with us, come up there. It's really a striking facility. I feel so lucky to be with these four men today. They are authors. I've read all their books, really enjoyed and was edified by them, and was struck by, in a world where we've really tried to promote women and tried to address so many of the difficulties women have had righting the wrongs of the past, men have it tough. They have it tough, and they have it tougher these days, maybe than they have had recently. And I'm really struck by the memoirs of, let's say, Bill and Grant, as they tried to sort of do their best through the system and what they encountered along the way. Also, these are men who know each other, who have conferred with one another and taken solace from each other upon occasion. They're going to discuss their books for the first hour, and then at 3 o'clock, we'll take questions from the audience. I hope you pepper them with questions. If not, I've got some doozies. And I'm going to start with bios of each of them, starting with Grant and going this way. And after their bios, I'll say, each of you stand up and talk for 5 minutes about your book and what you hope to achieve with it. So Grant is the author of a gripping memoir, Hand on the Shoulder, Finding Freedom in the Confluence of Love and Career. He grew up in Orange County, Virginia, with small town values, but he fast became an IBM executive at a time when IBM ruled the world. Grant loved the company, at least at first, and his much heralded work there until the pressures became too great. Hand on the Shoulder is about what the world did to him and how he survived at IBM and how he managed to come out on the other side, a full and happy guy. Bill Leidy has just published a fascinating book about his career called Capital Secrets. He is a proud Marine who as a young man was drawn into state government in Virginia, and I mean a very young man, right out of the service. Served as chief of staff to Governors Mark Warner and Tim Kaine. He's a get-or-done kind of guy who is great with money and state budgets. And he served for 7 years as head of the Virginia retirement system. He is now the Senior Strategic Advisor to the Dean of the Doug Wilder School of Government at Virginia Commonwealth University. Lucky you and lucky them. Russ Linden is the author of Loss and Discovery, What the Torah Can Teach Us About Leading Change. He's been an adjunct faculty member at the University of Virginia and the FEI, the Federal Executive Institute. Russ helps leaders foster innovation and change in their own workplaces, corporations, institutions. And he understands change is what we fear the most. And he's wise about teaching people how to get past that fear, how to embrace the change, to introduce the change to others. And he finds inspiration in the Torah and helping us get through it. David Toscano, I've known the longest. I knew David before he ran for office, when he was a young whippersnapper
40 years.
with a gleam in his eye, a political gleam. He is the author of Fighting Political Gridlock, How States Shape Our Nation and Our Lives. After serving as mayor of Charlottesville, David was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates. He held the same seat there for 14 years as Thomas Jefferson once held. The last 7 years in office, he held the powerful position of House Democratic leader. He left in 2020 to resume his law practice. He writes a very interesting blog called Why States Matter. So guys, let me start with David and go back this way. Please tell us about your book, your inspiration for it, and what you want us to take from it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and it's an honor to be on the panel with these guys and this wonderful woman that I've known for so long. And I'm hoping I'm going to learn a lot from you all, and maybe you'll learn a little bit from me, the small town country lawyer. The inspiration for Fighting Political Gridlock is really having experienced 14 years in state government and recognizing during that period of time the significance of the states in terms of our entire federal operation. Because what happens in the states largely leads to what happens in the country. And you can see it in full strength in terms of how Congress people get elected to Congress. They get elected to Congress with maps drawn in states controlled either by Democrats or Republicans in districts that somehow tend to be skewed one way or the other. And so your choice and your selection of a congressperson is dictated by what the state did, not what the federal government did. And so they've been sending a pipeline of people who've been pretty conservative in their orientation, and that's the way they control the Congress and control the country. There's a great book called Red Mat that describes how the Republicans woke up after the Obama election and said, look, if we're ever going to have any control in the federal government, we're going to have to take over the states, because it's the states that will dictate who gets elected to Congress and who will control it. So as a result of that thinking about states, I got more deeply enmeshed in everything that states did, whether it's voting rights, whether it was redistricting, whether it was healthcare, whether it was energy, you name it. Education, of course, is the number one thing. And I began to say, well, wait a minute here. The things that are happening in the states are really having an impact on what's happening in the country as a whole. So I wrote the book about that. And since then, I write this blog. It was called Why States Matter at one time. Now it's called The Fight of Our Lives, because it's kind of a play on the notion that we are in the fight of our lives for our democracy. Unless we get engaged and start thinking about this stuff, we could lose it. So I appreciate being here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, David. Russ Linden.
Morning, good afternoon, whatever it is. Thanks again, Abby. I wrote this book, Loss and Discovery, What We Can Learn from the Torah About Change, right when the pandemic was hitting. And it struck me that people in my field often talk about how change is constant. It's the only constant. It's only getting faster. When I looked around, I realized it's not only change, it's disruptive change. The pandemic, January 20th, disruptive election, good change, the Me Too movement, climate issues that we've never seen before. I thought about the Hebrew Bible. I go to the synagogue every Saturday, and as you may know, we read through the Hebrew Bible and start again at the beginning of the next year. And it's filled with disruption. The Great Flood, the Exodus from Egypt, God telling Moses to change his life, the same with Abraham. So a few things that come out of the book that strike me as important. It's often said by people who consult with others, leaders like David and you guys, that you're not a leader unless you have followers, and you won't have followers unless they trust you. And the notion of trust in relationships goes throughout the Bible. It starts at the beginning. God creates man, and then God says it's not good for man to be alone. And there's a woman in relationships to all the key characters. The second lesson from the Torah, you have to put your ego aside and have a little empathy if you're going to be a leader. My favorite character in the Torah is Joseph, his father's favorite, which is not good if you've got 11 brothers and you're the favorite. So they throw him in a pit. He almost dies. He goes into prison later. But then he becomes more of an adult. He looks around and he sees a couple of prisoners. They don't look like themselves. He says, "Is something wrong? You look troubled." He developed empathy. When he became the CEO of Egypt, he had no ego problems. He deferred it to all the things that he did to God. So having your ego in control and being curious, the second thing I get from the Torah. Third, are there any perfectionists in the room? I have a little bit, so I can kind of relate. It helps to let go of perfectionism, especially when everything is disrupted. Because you know what? In these times, a lot of us aren't at our best. I keep saying this to my clients. Let go of perfectionism. The Hebrews wandered for 40 years. They had no idea where they were going. So one of the lessons I've learned is something that some people in our field call the 80% rule. If you're trying to make a change, don't shoot for perfect. Who knows what perfect is anyway? Get something that's pretty good, tweak it, and then move forward. Otherwise, you'll be arguing about what's perfect, and you'll never get anywhere. A fourth thought from the Torah. When we lead change, we sometimes get excited, we leaders, because we can see the end result. But sometimes in a large organization, in the General Assembly and the organizations you guys have led, it's hard for people to see what it's going to mean to them. So there's a phrase I like to use, which is give people a line of sight. Help them see something that will come from the change you're asking them to make that's meaningful to them. And I can go into later some examples from the Bible. And finally, you talked about change and why it's hard. There's a wonderful quote from a different book called Leadership on the Line by two great authors. And in the first chapter, it was worth the cost of the book because what they wrote was, people don't necessarily resist change. People resist loss. Put the book down. Boy, that's my experience. I've asked lots of leaders to consider change, and sometimes they're happy with it. But when the net of it is they think they're going to lose something, or their subordinates feel like they're going to lose something, we're in trouble. So when you lead change, anticipate what might people worry about. We're excited because we're leading the change, but what might they be worrying about, and see if we can manage that. There's more to say, but thank you. Good to be here.
Wonderful, Russ. Bill Lighty.
Awesome to be here with you all today. Thank you. It's a pleasure to share a podium, if you will, with these wonderful friends of mine that I've gotten to know over the years. And this guy is just never keeps learning. When I kind of started talking to Abby and my sister-in-law about maybe doing a book talk here, I thought, well, wait a minute, Grant's right there in Charlottesville too. He just finished publishing a book with the same publisher, by the way, that I did. My good friend Russ is here in Charlottesville, and David Toscano, we all had just finished our books, and I thought, wow, it's great. But Grant loaded our books into ChatGPT and said, what do these 4 books have in common? And oh, by the way, ChatGPT, would you put together an agenda for us for today? And would you generate some questions for us to ask each other? Which all was done with ChatGPT. And I'm like, chat what? But anyway, it's wonderful to be here. I wrote this book, Capital Secrets. By the way, the title was generated not by me. My title was 12 Governors because that's the 12 governors I serve. But my publisher said, no, you put secrets in the title, it will sell more. So that's how we planned it. This book is very much a Facebook book. I'm a big poster on Facebook, and every week or two, or sometimes twice a week, I would post a story from my career. And people kept commenting on these stories with, the hell with the stories, Bill, write a damn book. And so when the crescendo got loud enough, I sat down actually February 22nd of last year, took all my Facebook stories and put them in one Word document and started moving them around and thought there might be something here for a book. So that's how I got this book done. It covers an awful lot of ground. It covers, hopefully in a very humorous way, what it's really like to be inside of the Virginia state government, and cast a little bit about the personalities on the 12 governors that I worked for over the years. There is, however, one big context for this book that you need to understand. And this story will put the book in context. We were vying with, the state of Virginia was vying with Philadelphia and Boston to film the life story of John Adams, HBO 10-part series. Paul Giamatti was John. And the executive producer was Tom Hanks. And so I went in to brief Governor Warner and I said, Governor, doesn't look good. Boston's offering $4 million in tax incentives to the film company. Philadelphia is offering $2 million in tax incentives to the film company. Our package is $400,000. And he said, damn it, Blighty, it's not about the money. It's about personal relationships. The problem here isn't the money. The problem here is you haven't gotten Tom Hanks to my house for drinks. I thought, wow, okay, well, he's absolutely right. I haven't gotten Tom Hanks for drinks. So I went back to my office and I did what any of you would have done. I picked up my phone and I called Oprah Winfrey. And we arranged for drinks at the governor's mansion, 12:30 a.m. on a Sunday morning, which is the only time Tom Hanks could do it. So there we are in the governor's mansion at 12:30 a.m., middle of the night, and the conversation is not going very well because Tom Hanks is drinking sodas instead of bourbon, which is Mark Warner's method of getting you to agree, to get you drunk. But anyway, pausing the conversation, and I looked over at Tom Hanks and I said, gee, Mr. Hanks, how could you possibly want to film the life story of John Adams and not want to go sit in the office, in the chair in the office that his arch rival, Thomas Jefferson, designed for the governor of Virginia? And he's lit up and said, can we? The governor said, sure. So we're about this time, about 1:30 in the morning, we're walking across from the Capitol to the Capitol from the governor's mansion. I'm on the phone telling the Capitol, please turn this light on, open that door. And I proceed to give Tom Hanks a private tour of Mr. Jefferson's temple on the hill in the middle of the night. And I'm explaining the significance of this statue and why we have this painting here. And I'm going into quite a bit of depth about the tour. And Mark Warner says, damn it, Lighty, we don't have time for the 3-hour tour. Give him the 30-second tour. And Tom Hanks says, no, Governor, I love history. I'm absorbing every word he says. And Mark Warner says, I wouldn't if I were you, Tom. He makes most of that shit up. So that, I want you to understand, that is the context for this book. Thank you.
All right, Grant, you're free to swear.
So, really back to the beginning of 2022, end of 2021, I got a call from the publisher that did this, a young woman, and said, have you ever thought of writing a book? I said, yeah, sure, everybody has, right? And she said, well, I think you should do it. So we had, I think, 3 different conversations, and I decided I didn't want to write a 50,000 verse business book for the year. And so it turned out that I had a collection of stories I'd done over the years, and decided that that's something I should do. It turned out that it was a great activity in self-examination, trying to confront things that I had not confronted before. So what are those things? I'm a small town kid, grew up in Orange. Some friends are here from Orange. In Orange High School, there were 52 people in my graduating class. And I graduated 16th. And decided to stick around for a year to do postgraduate work, to learn to type and a few other things, worked in the physics lab, then went to UVA. And then came out of UVA, went to work for the IBM company. That was just sort of on the cusp of computer work at the time. At age 25, I found myself leading an organization of 100 people. 5 people who were the senior managers reporting to me. 3 of those 5 had started the company before I was born. So I had a quick learning experience of how to work in that environment. And then fast forward, at the time I ran into sort of personal crisis. I was working for a fellow who in a division at 30,000 people. And I was responsible for helping him organize the division we were in. And I described the division, we poured in sand and we got it computers. We were making chips and we were making big computers. And I was sent to do some turnaround work for a lab that had 900 people. But so one of the questions that AI designed for me was, how do you manage ambition with personal? And so my friend Bill hit it on the head. It really wasn't ambition. I didn't want power. Didn't want lots and lots of money, but I saw management as helping people. And when I realized that core drive, and that if I could learn, and that helps me do that thing. And it all goes back to a couple of sayings that from my childhood. One was my grandmother, father's mother, said, "You have a talent, and you're not using it, it's a sin." In other words, it will straight to hell if you don't do your job. And the other one was from the high school principal, Mr. Walker, who said, "Everybody is good and it's up to you, Grant, to find it." So that's sort of been my thing. And to sort of build on what Russ said, another thing from my father, who said, here's the theory of change. He didn't call it that, but that's what I call it. You can roll a cannonball at a frog. It jumps out of the way every time. But if you roll it BBs, it will eat them until they can't hop.
Oh, that's great. So I didn't realize till I got here that these questions you all had me start them off with were computer generated. And so I'll ask them, but I'm not pleased. David Toscano, you've said that states have come up with innovative ways to get around the political gridlock in Washington. Give us examples of how they've done this and how we might use that to further, anti-gridlock at the local level and other areas.
Yeah, it's a great question. I never really liked the title of the book, Fighting Political Gridlock, because sometimes there's gridlock and sometimes there's not. I mean, right in the last year or so, you could argue that the federal government, with the exception of trying to shut it down periodically, has actually passed a number of things: infrastructure bill, a CHIPS bill, a whole series of bills that actually are pretty change generating. I mean, I think they're pretty good things for the country. But anyway, I'll give you a couple examples, and some are conservative, from conservative states. The whole issue of Roe v. Wade and abortion. Conservative states tried to figure out a way around the court issues that were generated out of Roe v. Wade, and the federal government's unwillingness to do what they wanted them to do, which was to pass a federal ban on abortion. So what they did was put in all these regulations to make abortion much more difficult. And then they passed all these so-called trigger laws that would go into effect immediately if Roe v. Wade was overturned, which in fact it was. And a lot of these trigger laws in many of these southern states went into effect. Now, that was a pretty creative way of getting around the gridlock at DC. Not one that I really like that much, but it certainly is a way. But a couple of classic other examples. For years and years and years, the federal government and the Congress dabbled with trying to pass some kind of health care for everyone in the country, right? Truman failed, Clinton failed, but a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature in Massachusetts, of all places, passed an Affordable Care Act for Massachusetts, which turned out to be the model for Obamacare in a unique way that a state went around the gridlock in DC. nowadays, the most common examples you see really come out of the climate change arena, where the federal government hasn't been able to do much of anything until really recently. So states have gone in and they passed legislation putting a cap on carbon emissions in their state. Or 11 states now that are in a regional compact called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That's a state-initiated compact that is now in place. And that was an attempt by, in this case, climate change-oriented states to say the feds aren't going to do it. We're going to try to do it at the state level. You're seeing some more innovation in the healthcare arena now in states than you've ever seen before, all of which I think is probably a good thing. But those are a couple examples. I have others too when you want to get to them.
What do you most want to see us do at the state level? You know, what can you see the rest of us can't see?
Well, the biggest thing we have to do is change how we do our voting. You could argue that the John Lewis voting rights bill was before the Congress for a couple of years. Everybody wanted that bill to pass because it would have fixed a problem the Supreme Court created several years ago when they essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act. Well, none of us who are really watching what's going on in the country thought that that bill has snowball's chance in hell of passing. But some states, Virginia being one of them, there aren't that many. I think there are 3 of them, passed their own voting rights acts that set up an arrangement at the state level to make sure that there were protections against people compromising the rights of people trying to vote. So I think at the state level, states can pass really good voting rights and voting protections at the state level and not worry about the federal government. The other place where we can go is redistricting. And we know that redistricting has been operating in a way to essentially protect incumbents for a long time, usually conservative incumbents, and essentially allow states to control the policy arrangements at the state level without having voters getting in the way of that. I mean, how else do you explain Ohio? Ohio is a supermajority Republican state. It now passes a pro-choice amendment and puts it in the Constitution with 57% of the vote. That tells you something's askew in Ohio, and that the people who are elected to that legislative body don't really reflect the majority of the public.
Hush. What do you think about watching the returns on Tuesday, on November 7th? Is that when it was? And seeing once again the early vote come in super late made me fear for our system that the perception is this isn't fair. You know, we're used to a lifetime of waiting for the returns to come in through the night, and having the early returns come in late and flip the vote feels unfair as a perception.
Well, I think that helped create the perception nationally that the election with Trump was stolen. I mean, stop the steal partly was a reflection of these late votes coming in. Now, states have changed some of that so that they can count the votes earlier. And the good news out of Virginia is there really haven't been all that many election deniers. There are a couple have been elected to the House of Delegates. But you notice Youngkin didn't say that the election was corrupt. He didn't say it was unfair. They just said, look, we lost. And that's a good thing. We hope that more people who lose elections will, if the system is right, fair, will say the election was fair. We ought to respect the people who were elected.
Yeah. Russ, what practical approaches from the Torah have you found that you think can foster a culture of innovation and change within an organization? Give us examples of how these lessons can be practical in our lived lives.
Yeah, I love that question. Well, I mentioned briefly when I stood up that most people don't necessarily resist change, we resist loss. So let me remind you, if you have, or tell you if you haven't read this part of the Bible, God goes to Moses. Moses is 80 years old. He's been living in the country called Midian, peacefully with his in-laws, with his wife, his kids. And God comes along, there's the burning bush, and Moses realizes he's in the presence of some awesome power. God says, Moses, I knew your ancestors. This is kind of like saying to someone you meet, I don't know you, but I knew your mom. And I've heard the groaning of the Israelites in slavery, and I want you to go back to Egypt, where Moses had come from, grew up there, and free the people. And Moses is stunned, doesn't know what to say. He says, who am I, God, to do that? Let's just stop there. Who am I? What loss is he fearing? He's in a comfortable place. He's going back. By the way, he left because he was wanted because he had killed an Egyptian, beating an Israelite. So he's got comfort and safety, and now that's going to be potentially lost. He's asked to leave his family, which he's going to do. And he's going to take on a task that he has no idea how to do it. Let me just stop there and tell you something I learned in the research for this book. Wonderful psychologist in Charlottesville named Dave Waters co-authored a book. And the book identifies two fundamental needs that he, a therapist for 40-some years, he and his co-author had identified in all of their clients, or most of their clients. And the needs are for what they called mastery and belonging. I think of these as the me need to be competent and the we need to belong to something. So right away, God is threatening Moses' competence need. He doesn't know how to go back. God says, I will be with you. 4 powerful words. Dave Waters told me, when he's with his clients and he asks them to make a change, he always says or implies, infers, don't worry, I'll be with you in this change. Moses goes on, but I stutter, I'm slow of speech and tongue. God says, I'll tell you what to say. Again, Moses is worrying about his competency needs. Finally, at the end, Moses says, please take anybody. And God says, your brother Aaron will be there, and I'll tell him what to say, and he'll help you when you go to the Pharaoh. So little by little, God is reducing Moses' worries about loss. By the way, when I say most people don't resist change, resist loss, this is about positive changes too. How many of you can remember, if you've had children, remember your first child?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a blessing, right? I think it's a miracle. What did we lose?
Freedom.
Only freedom?
Sleep.
Sleep?
Money.
Money, of course.
Yeah.
What else? Time? Energy? I can remember my wife, Jackie, would go into the bathroom and close it. She didn't have to go. She just wanted a little control over her damn life because she felt totally out of control. So we have to understand that we can help people when we help them realize we can reduce the loss. I want to give you another example in the Torah, and it's a great example of helping people with the competency needs. At one point, God says to the people, build a mishkan, which is a Hebrew word for a tabernacle, a moving tabernacle that will go with you in all these wanderings, a place where my spirit can dwell. So I told you when I stood up that one of the things that the Torah teaches and a lot of management consultants think about is, how do we help people see the line of sight? What's the meaningful result of what we're asking you to do? Quite often when you're at the top of an organization, we say, let's do something. By the time it trickles down, nobody can remember the why. They just know they're going to have to do it. And for those of us who have millennial kids, these young folks want to know the why. And unlike some of us baby boomers who, when we were told we just did it, they're going to ask. So God says, build a tabernacle, and God gives all the blueprints. And then God says, those of you who are willing, make the curtains this way. And those of you who are willing, make the table this way. And one after another, God talks about what might happen, how it looks, and he's playing to people's strengths. It's a classic management. Grant, you and I have talked about this, a classic management strategy. But notice the words, if you are willing, it's a choice. It's a choice which gives people some control. So those are a couple of examples of what we can remember. How do we reduce the loss? How do we play to people's needs for competency and belonging?
And then there are moments of crisis like we find ourselves in now. Have you turned to the Torah to look for, how do we get out of this?
At Moses' lowest moment, when the people, there's a Yiddish word, kvetch, the people have been kvetching, have been complaining for 40 years. Most of them never got to the promised land, not only Moses. At one point, God says everybody 20 years and older, because God gets upset with all of this complaining. At Moses' lowest moment, the people are saying, Moses, where's the food we remember, the fresh food and the fresh meat we had in Egypt? As slaves, give me a break. They weren't having any food like that. But, memory is an interesting thing, right? Moses is so upset. He feels like this people is never going to be able to handle the responsibilities of freedom. By the way, when the people left slavery, ironically, they were losing some things, like what's going to happen tomorrow. Like, what are the people around me like? They didn't know what God would be. They didn't know what a land of milk and honey would be. 40 years it took. So Moses is so upset. He says, God, take my life. I've read this dozens of times. It never struck me until I read it more finally. And God says, Moses, take, I don't know if it was 40 or 60, take a number of the elders whom you trust, and they will help you with your responsibilities. So one way to get through crazy times is to use our networks. Another way to get rid of through crazy times is to be more self-forgiving. As I said earlier, a lot of us are not at our best when things are so disruptive. So can we forgive ourselves when we're not at our best? We Jews ask for forgiveness once a year, but I think it's a holiday we ought to have a lot more frequently because we all need that.
Feels good. Thank you. Thank you for that insight. Bill Whitey, before I ask you my AI question, I'm going to ask you to tell us the story that I loved. And I ran into the other room and said, Bob, did you know this? Because my husband, Bob, had covered state politics for decades. And this was the feisty, powerful state senator, Ed Willie. And how Ed Willie teamed up with one of his powerful minions, I'll call Hunter Andrew a minion, and counted votes to make sure he knew when to withdraw legislation or push it forward.
Well, it was pretty simple, actually. But Ed Willie had full control of the Senate floor. And his mechanism for doing that was, if you look at the Senate floor of the Senate of Virginia, there are 8 slices of pie with 5 seats in each of the slices. You have 2 front seats, 3 back seats. And so Ed Willie had what he called the Secret Seven.
The secret what?
Secret Seven. The Secret Seven, which were never officially recognized. And you really didn't know about the Secret Seven unless you was one. And so Ed Willie had a confidant, one confidant in each of the 7 other pieces of pie besides himself. And what he would do is, he would give, when he thought there had been enough debate, he would give the nod to Hunter Andrews, the majority leader. And Hunter Andrews would rise, and Ed Willie would look around. And, you know, Doc Truban over with the Republicans would say, you got 3 votes here. And Howard Anderson would say, you got 4 votes here. And, you know, Todd Duvall would say, you only got 1 over here. And so Ed Willie always knew what the vote was going to be on every bill. And if he didn't have enough votes, then he would nod again, and Hunter Andrews would sit down. And his Secret Seven would go to work to round up the votes. But he never took a vote that he didn't know the outcome of. So that was that, and the fact that he had this little trick. Well, it wasn't a trick. He was chairman of finance. And basically what he did was he told all the senators, if you vote for the budget bill, I will give you $10,000 in the budget for whatever special thing you need for every year you've been in the Senate. And if you're on the committee, I will give you $100,000 for every year you're on the committee. So, and then he would tuck these little appropriations for the Tobacco Textile Museum, you know, the reading rights for whatever, on your behalf, you put a little language in the budget. And then if you voted for the budget bill, but then if you didn't vote for the budget bill, he would have it mysteriously in conference, and then you would lose the money. So that was the other tool he had.
What was the story you tell of the state senator who defied him and didn't vote for the budget but still wanted his money?
Annika Barker from Danville was in his 4th year, and he put in an amendment for $40,000 for the Danville Textile and Tobacco Museum, nonprofit. And when he testified for his amendment, he said it was the first time he'd ever asked for money. And Senator Willie said, that's not true. 2 years ago, you asked for $20,000 for the same thing. Can you tell the committee what happened? And he said, well, the committee approved the budget amendment, but then it disappeared in conference. And Senator Willie said, well, Annika, why do you think it disappeared in conference? He said, because I voted against the budget bill. And Senator Willie said, so Annika, if we get this $40,000 this year, what do you think you'll do in the future? He said, I think I'll vote for the budget.
That's wild. Now your AI question. Having served under 12 US governors, what are the key leadership principles you've observed that foster a culture of innovation within governmental organizations?
Well, you qualify it there a great deal with innovation. But you know, one of the hallmarks of all of the government governors that I served was that their willingness to serve others and their desire to get into the political world. But I think the difference between them that makes them more successful individually is their decision-making process, how quickly they decide, how much they rely or don't rely on others. You could not have found more different governors than Tim Kaine and Mark Warner in terms of personality and decision-making style. They both were risk takers, but Mark Warner was a venture capital risk taker. He measured every risk before making a decision, and quickly too, by the way. I mean, it took a long time to make a decision. Tim Kaine was more of a plaintiff's attorney risk taker. He was like, well, hell, I've been in court with less than this. Let's throw this up on the wall and see what happens. And so they were very different kind of risk takers. And they were really different in the way they made their decisions. Mark Warner liked 15, 20 people in the room arguing with each other and with him about what the right course of action was. Tim Kaine liked a 20-page decision brief and a bottle of half-flat Dr. Pepper with classical music on in the background while he sat alone in his office to make the decisions. So they were very, very different. But what they had in common was they were quick decision makers. They looked at a situation and made decisions quickly. And I think that is one of the hallmarks of really good leadership.
Last thing, would you tell them about how you got into the Marines? You sort of backed into it, and so did Grant in his own way. But it's a fascinating story because these days a lot of people aren't going into the military that we know, but both of you did and were deeply impressed by it. I mean, it had a lasting effect on you.
Well, in my case, in 1971, there weren't a lot of people volunteering to go into the military of any kind of the Marines, because Vietnam was still pretty hot and heavy. But my senior year of high school, I went to see my guidance counselor, Mrs. Long, and I said, gee, Mrs. Long, I guess it's time for me to think about college. And she said, no, not you, Bill. It would be a waste of your parents' money to apply. And I said, gee, Mrs. Long, what do you think I should do? And she said, have you ever thought about joining the Marine Corps? And I said, you know what I will. And strangely enough, that night after dinner, the phone rang. It was a Marine Corps recruiter by the name of Staff Sergeant Long. You guys got it quicker than I did. We can't not figure it out.
Oh my God.
Right?
In any event, I signed up for 4 years. I will have to tell you, that was in 1971. In 1995, I became head of the Virginia retirement system. And I looked up Mrs. Long on the retiree file. And I saw her letter about who was sending her check now. And she wrote back and said how she always believed in me.
Thank you for my husband's commission. Right. All right. Grant, would you start with the military and then tell us about your?
Yes, well, I went to UVA and I was in the ROTC. And, it was before the Vietnam was really starting. But my term was a 6-month term to go into the Army. And I went in 2nd Signal Corps as a 2nd lieutenant. And I went, go through basic training again. So I went through the basic training and time came for us to go find out where our assignment was. And so I walked into this colonel's office, stood up front, saluted, and said, Lieutenant Tate, he said, you work for IBM, right? Yes, sir. Said, we've assigned you to the Signal Research and Development Line. And so I came out of that with a very different military occupational specialty, so-called MOS, Electronic Engineer Research and Development.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Vietnam heated up, and I was, said, here I am, you send me if you want. They said, well, we don't have a place for electronic engineers. And every year during the 7.5 years I was in reserve, I kept saying, I need my active duty. And they said, well, and finally I said, okay, I'm going to go back for a month and went to Fort Monmouth for, guess what, a 30-day electronic computer specialty for staff offices. So, the same thing. Didn't do combat, didn't do a long-term in, but the profound impact on leadership and what you gain in the military is something I have deep respect for. And the fact that, you know, if someone had called, I would have been ready. Sort of also reflecting on the book a bit, and the AI question.
Yes.
1982. I was with a small team. We were responsible for introducing the IBM personal computer into Europe, and the European market, primarily overseas. And we were going through all the checkpoints of what we had to do. And nobody in the headquarters had ever seen one. So I asked my guy I work with, the next time you invoke a Raton, bring back one of those things. And so he came back with 3 boxes. We opened it up in my office, plugged the things together, turned it on, and the thing worked. And at that time, we were spending, we were spending 3 to 5 days in the customer's office to try to get a chip computer that's, big enough to fit in this corner of the room and work. And so we were playing with the thing and trying some programs, and heard a noise, and we looked out the door. Must have been 20 people looking at this. And we said, "Oh my God, this is a revolution. No longer will people have to stand in line to get their stuff processed with a big computer. This is going to change the world." You've seen the result of that revolution with internet, everything we do today. We're on the verge of another one, which is the artificial intelligence revolution. It's probably bigger than that one was at the time. And so the little work we did here is just a small segment of what can happen. I won't go out on that today, but that's what I'm doing. So, but also in 1982, swinging back to that, I had completed my dissertation and was going to Peace University to receive my recognition and career. And my relationship was on the rocks. And it was actually the last meeting I think my wife and I attended together. Why was that? Well, I was so absorbed in all the things I was doing that I was not paying attention to the relationship. And so one of the key elements of the lessons here, I hope for people, is the importance of balance in your taking care of your relationship and doing your work. I was driven just by the things I mentioned earlier, to try to do things. I'm still driven to a degree, but I'm driven about learning and helping people, and that's where my energy goes. But at the same time, my wife, Angeline, is here, and one of the freedoms we give each other is freedom to be ourselves, which is exceptionally important. And she just finished a marathon yesterday. I was here. But at the same time, she cheers me every day. In 1982, when that happened to me, I didn't have one person I could talk to that I could trust. Whose fault was that? Points in one direction. And I said to myself, that will never, ever happen to me again. And so for the following years, up until now, I have worked on trying to help people, trying to develop good relationships, trying to listen to people, trying to be a coach, be a good consultant, and help other people. That's my road back.
Sarah, can I make an observation?
Yes.
All 4 of us directly or indirectly talked about relationships. I don't know if you find this, David, but I've been told that relationships are much easier at the state level than at the federal level. You're not even supposed to be seen with the other side. Obviously talked about it. Grant, your book is filled with that. Bill, you're talking about Mark Warner. And he said, it's not about money, it's about relationships when you were trying to get the film done there. Seems to be a common thread through so many different parts of life.
Here, here.
Don't you think it's also, you said whose fault is that mine, but especially during the era that you're talking about, isn't it a guy thing? I mean, weren't men, especially during that period, I mean, there weren't talks and facilities and encouragements for men to have relationships. I guess if you were lucky and happened to have them, was another thing. What would you all say?
Well, I think guys have a harder time making relationships.
Yeah.
And maybe guys of our age have a harder time than guys who are younger. I mean, I don't want to speak for the younger generation, but that's what it seems to me. I know it's my son. He has a lot of relationships with a lot of people.
Yeah.
And men, women. But I was thinking just this weekend, we were walking around the downtown mall, and I would see these groups of women who had come together to go to the Dave Matthews concert, right? It didn't look like they were with their spouses. And I don't think you have that same kind of situation with guys. Now, occasionally they go to football games together, but it's not quite the same thing. So I think it's harder for guys.
Well, it's interesting because I used to do every year, I went on PGA tour, post General Assembly golf to Myrtle Beach with a group of guys. And it struck me that, wait a minute, we're all white guys, we're all the same age. Why are we not including anyone else? And then I thought, well, wait a minute. So if we ask Deborah Dodson to join us, I don't think our wives would think that was a good use of collegial time. Take her away for 5 days with us in Myrtle Beach. And so it was actually, if you stop and think about it, it would have been nice to be more inclusive, but you risk your reputation having too close a relationship, at least at my age, with women in the office, which made it more difficult.
But Grant, you seem to enjoy the colleagues who are working together on projects at IBM, that was a great joy to have that camaraderie. And they were, for the most part, men.
Yeah, well, in 1982, when I mentioned that, not having someone to talk to, I could never, because of organizational constraints as well as the culture, it wouldn't have been open for me to go say to my leader, the person I reported to, or even my colleagues, that I'm having trouble at home. Not something I don't admit. Now, leading forward to the last years that I was at IBM, the department I headed at corporate education had over 60% women, professionals. And some of the difficulties we faced, and it's described in the book actually, is I was one of the people who reported to me came in one day and she'd been acting strange for a few months, and finally admitted to me that one of my colleagues, a very high-level manager, was actively harassing her with a lot of details. And I said, "We've got to do something about this." Multiple conversations, but basically said, "It's going to get rough. We're going to ask you a lot of difficult questions. Are you ready to do this?" And she said, "Yes." And I think it was the first example, first case of sexual harassment that the company had ever faced at the corporate level. I described some of it here, but that was a very, very emotional and difficult track. That was just one of several incidents I had, because there's another fellow who, in this case, one of my colleagues, an African American man, who had made offhand comments to another woman reporting to me who was an African-American woman, a PhD. And so I called him in to my office and just said, look, this is what I've heard about that meeting, and that kind of behavior is not acceptable here or anywhere else in the country. And he got furious and he was standing up over my desk and shouting at me. And I said, look, fine, if that's the way you want to do it, then you and I will go to our mutual management, we'll talk about this. And, but at that time, the company had strong, good, as we would say, DEI policies. And so I knew that I had complete backing of the corporate hierarchy. But that's sort of, I think, my little experience was just a small fraction of what was going on, all the working relationships, of course, at that time, 400,000 people.
In the company.
Yeah.
So Sarah, if I could build on some of what these other folks have said, in the political realm, the relationships are really the key. I mean, and Russ talks about change and loss, the fear of loss. So the relationships, if you have a relationship with someone who you trust and they're asking you to vote for a certain thing that you don't know too much about, and you could easily go either way on, they can help you get there if you trust them, and they can also just talk with you any feelings of loss. And I've seen this happen a lot, and Bill, I imagine you've seen it too, where people you had to get over the finish line, the infamous Warner 2003 tax reform bill. Yeah. So you had to get a certain number of Republicans to come across the line, and man, there were a lot of them were scared to death to take that vote with Warner. And the way there was pressure from the outside, from the localities, and pressure from the inside from Warner and all your good work to get them there. But there was some level of trust, including the notion that maybe we won't run anybody strong against you in the next election, So that happens all the time in politics, and people may not really know about it. The other thing about the state government versus federal, those relationships are totally broken down at the federal level, mainly because people don't see each other very much. They come in for a Tuesday and then they're going on Thursday afternoon. When you're in the General Assembly, pretty much people stay there most of the time when you're in session. It's not as strong, the relationship building, as it used to be in the past when lobbyists were more involved in taking people out to dinner together, Democrats and Republicans. That's another sad situation with how everybody trashes lobbyists, but actually they're one of the best trust builders you can find in the General Assembly, because usually they tell you the straight skinny on a bill one way or the other. But there are more opportunities at the state level. And I think that's where you have to start building back these notions of civility and stuff, because when these people get elected to Congress, maybe they'll take some of those norms with them.
And that is not a small point. This idea that over food and drink
Right.
and socializing, we build trust. I mean, that's, you have to have that. You really can't just do it, in the 9 to 5. And it's ironic, as you're saying, to hear you say, lobbyists provided some of that.
Right.
Some folks in Congress I've heard say that one of the best ways to do this without saying, hey, we need to get together and trust each other, is to invite someone to go on a congressional delegation overseas.
Yep.
Because think about it. Maybe
Even from the other side of the aisle.
especially from the other side,
Yeah.
you'd be in a plane, you're going to be having some drinks, you
Yeah.
have time between all these meetings.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
perfect.
L.F. Payne tells countless stories of people that he went overseas with and got to know so much better from doing that.
But it also points out you're an American.
Yeah, that's right.
What did you say, Grant?
It points out you are an American when you're with a delegation together
Uh-huh.
in another country.
and cements a bond
Right.
that you didn't realize you had. This is the time where we hope you have questions for all these guys and really get into it. Gibson.
One of the things that made this book is that the states are in fact, as we've always been told, laboratories of democracy. Well, there are good labs and there are bad labs. And my question is, what happens when half the states on a major issue go one way, and the other half of the states on the other issue go the other way, and you have something criminalized here that is applied here?
You have what we're having these days, which is this schism in the country where you got a whole set of states going one way and a whole set of states going another way. And how does it get resolved when you don't have strong leadership in you know, in the courts that can help do that? And you don't have strong educational institutions that are working on breaking that down for younger people who are coming up through the system. You know, I'm really troubled about for the future of the country because of this. And, you know, every once in a while, I think we should just take 20% of the population of Charlottesville, move them all to Oxford, Mississippi, and try to take over the state. I mean, you laugh about that, but really, I mean, we're more geographically segmented by politics now than we ever have been, and people now are moving based on their politics. You know, they won't go to Oxford, Mississippi because of the nature of that state. So I don't know. I don't have the answer. I mean, your civics education stuff that you had been doing for a long, long time is part of it, but you got to get it going in every state, it's not just here.
Dr. Dickens.
Haven't heard from the Marine Corps and the Army and Navy. Thanks you for the opportunity to ask. Having practiced medicine for most of my life and watching the science of medicine advance more and more rapidly, and actually being impressed with the rate at which people in the legislature have to make decisions, you know, in a short legislative session. Is there a system in place to help decision makers be better informed about the ethical implications of the decisions they're being asked to make or votes they're being asked to cast? As opposed to the political implications.
Well, you know, there are a number of institutes out there who talk about things like ethics, but they don't really filter down much to legislators. And I don't know in the executive branch if you ever did retreats with these guys to talk about ethical issues, and I just don't see as much. I mean, we have the Sorensen Institute. They don't use ethics in the title, and they don't really talk about, quote, ethics. They talk about the term leadership, whatever that means, right?
There is a session on ethics in the program.
Oh, that's good. I guess that the legislators never got the memo.
Maybe you know, but it was, when I went through it was there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I teach at the Masters of Public Administration, and ethics, accountability, and transparency is now a required course.
Good.
But back to, you know, also Bob's question, and the whole idea of civic education. I'm chairman of the Virginia Public Access Project, and we're getting ready to embark on a rather aggressive, we hope, civics education initiative. And as we're doing the field work to ask people what is needed, and our idea was to go into the high schools and teach the civics, the government teachers about the importance of doing civics, and to more degree. And what those teachers are telling us, forget our kids, start with their parents, because their parents need it more than the kids do right now. And the kids will never get it if the parents don't. And so we really have missed several generations of solid civics education that would have laid the groundwork for more civility in the process. Sorry.
Totally true. It's so important to hear that. More questions, please.
Let me sum that up with
Yeah.
one last story in here. So, Leo Ward, who was a delegate in the General Assembly, very conservative Republican for Virginia Beach, stopped me in the aisle one day and said, "Bill, when you go back upstairs to see Governor Warner, please tell him how much I admire what he's doing and what he's trying to accomplish. I would go up there myself, but right now I've got to go to the floor and kick his ass. They know what they're doing. I mean, they're aware of the lines that they're crossing politically versus what needs to be done. And never forget that 95% of what happens in the General Assembly is decided on a nonpartisan basis. Your biggest fights in the Virginia General Assembly, I can't speak for Congress, but in the Virginia General Assembly, your biggest fights are between the rural and the urban delegates, and between the House and the Senate. And the House and the Senate fights are the ones that create long-lasting negative relationships, quite frankly.
So I was thinking about what Russ said about loss, and so I'm sort of thinking about that little incident about sexual harassment. You know, the possibility of loss was pretty high in that case. You know, we could lose, we could, like, you know, have been pushed down in many ways, but you know, what is the moral thing to do in that case? Is move ahead. And so I wonder in the political environment today, and I wonder this every day almost, when you see people making severe compromises at the national level, is what is the loss that they are concerned about? Is it simply not winning the next election, or is it a fear for their family and friends? And I am very frank that it's very much the second in a lot of those cases.
Yeah.
And so the fear of loss certainly is there in a lot of those situations, whatever that loss might be. But how do you calculate those things? And when you know it's time to stand up for what's right and not, you know, and take the risk of loss.
Grant, I'm teaching a online course with UVA students. These are people who never got their bachelor's. They're 30, 40, 50 years old, who really admirable stuff. And I did a session on ethics, and I gave them a particular scenario, and it doesn't have to go through the details. And one person just nailed it in terms of what they would do. And everybody said, wow, you would take that risk or loss or whatever. He said, look, my loss of self-respect would have been greater if I hadn't done the right thing.
Hmm.
So he was also thinking about loss, but in the sense of conscience. He had a conscience.
Time for drinks.
Stiff drinks. Right. Thank you, everybody. Let's do a little bit of meet and greet and maybe book signing. If Abby, you have some capacity for that.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
I'm reading this book now called